It's really my pleasure today to introduce Lincoln Mitchell, who spoke to us back in 2018 when we were in person, had a lot more people here. And he warned us then that the administration was moving away from democracy, and warning that that incumbent in the presidency would not respect normal democratic process or a peaceful transition of power if he wasn't reelected. I think that was very prescient, and that knowledge helped a lot of us to understand what was going to happen and as it was happening. Lincoln writes and studies about political development. He has worked here in New York City as a political consultant and currently teaches at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He has worked on democracy and governance issues in the former Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and over the last years has used that experience to understand and explain American politics and the current crisis of American democracy. He has been and currently is a contributor and columnist for a variety of publications. We asked him back this fall to do an update on where he sees democracy and authoritarianism today in our country, and to help us understand some of the ways we still need to respond. And there will be time at the end for responses or questions. So go for it, Lincoln.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for inviting me back. It's always good to have an opportunity to talk about these issues and discuss these questions. And I don't think you invited me back for my optimism, because I didn't bring any last time, and I probably will be less this time, but that's kind of where we are. In my world this week, there's been an article circulated by Robert Kagan from the Washington Post, an editorial with a title something like the constitutional crisis is now, which on the one hand would have been a very prescient headline in 2017. The article itself is actually pretty good, but that headline is significant because it shows to me just how difficult it is for Americans to really wrestle with what is going on. Now, obviously, the Washington Post is a relatively conservative institution, so that may be a bit of a straw man, but we are still constantly seeing headlines, are we in the middle of a constitutional crisis? And implicit in that headline is the notion that the Constitution is democratic, right? One of the problems of our democracy today is that we have a Constitution the democratic flaws of which are now really directly undermining American democracy. And to some extent, the American people are now faced with a choice. We can either live according to the Constitution or we can live in a democracy. It is no longer possible to do both, to even fake it. But the notion of what to me is obvious, that we are in a deep crisis of democracy. We are well down the road towards the collapse of American democracy, and to some extent the collapse of the American state, is something that is so hard for the American political elite, and by political elite, I mean very broadly speaking, to process, that we keep dancing around this. The denial is just so deep. And I don't mean to point fingers only at the media, but they are deeply complicit in this. The major story of the last 5 years is this collapse of democracy in the United States. And the media insists on going back to that headline, that horse race framework, that worshiping at the altar of bipartisanship, of both sidesism, and as a result has missed really the most important story in quite some time. And I want to, I also want to note that I really wrestle a lot internally with kind of recency bias, right? Is this the worst thing ever because it's happening now and I'm experiencing it? This is not the worst thing ever, but it is my sense that we are in a different point in American democracy than we have been really at any time in a very long time. And the way I would explain that is this: I don't have some kind of Pollyannish view of history where everything was great until Donald Trump came along. Quite the contrary. And if you look at my writing over the years, you'll see that, but just take me at my word on that. But one could argue that certainly from the end of this, well, say 1876 through pretty much the end of the 20th century, the curve of democracy was in the right direction. That was clear. And I would say that continued to be true until Donald Trump got elected. And in the last 4 years, that's begun to reverse itself. And now we are in this kind of gray area with that, where in many respects, it continues to reverse itself, but there are some signs. So I want to kind of give you an overview of what I call the depressing part of this. And then from there, we'll get to the really unhappy stuff. First, we all remember, and I assume many of us participated in the celebrations, really that were global, in November of last year, when the major networks here finally called the election for Joe Biden, after extending a courtesy to Donald Trump of 3 or 4 days for no reason at all. After the election, it was clear who was going to win by the Thursday after the votes stopped. And we all went to the streets and partied and celebrated. And that was a kind of global sense of relief, certainly a national sense of relief. But it sounds obvious, Joe Biden is not going to save us. And that is not necessarily a critique of Joe Biden. I voted for the guy. I voted for vice president twice. Joe Biden is a kind of standard capital D Democrat. He represents his party well. He's certainly a lot better than the alternative, but he and almost anyone in this situation is overmatched. And the same kind of Washington insider moderate temperament that helped him in that election makes it very difficult for him, I think him personally, to understand the extent of the crisis. Second thing I would say, and this I think also is kind of obvious, but I want to stress it, there are no easy answers. And the reason I say that is because I believe there is real value in explaining what the crisis is and in communicating that and in exploring that. But if you say you can't do that unless you have an answer, what you end up doing is shutting down a very important discourse. And I find myself getting upset when I give a talk about the state of democracy and someone says, what's the answer? And I say, look, if I had an answer, I would tell you. I'm not concealing something from you. And the fact that I don't have an answer doesn't make the critique any less relevant. But we are in a very difficult situation. It is not as simple as win the next election, right? That's obviously important, but it's not as simple as that. It is not as simple as go out there and vote, or what Barack Obama, among others, bizarrely told us in late 2016, early 2017, go out and run for office. If all of us went and primaried our nice liberal democratic state assembly person or city council person, we'd all lose, we'd all waste some money, and we wouldn't move the ball forward on American democracy at all. So there are no easy answers. There also are no guarantees. I often tell this story, and I'll tell it briefly now, but if I had at a high school graduation party told someone in a discussion of global politics, which never really happened at my high school graduation party, that, oh, the Soviet Union won't exist in 10 years, they would have told me I was crazy. 10 years later, there were seminars, not on the collapse of, and books, not on the collapse of the Soviet Union, but why it was inevitable, right? So in politics, as in life, the distance between the unimaginable and the inevitable is the snap of a finger. It's the blink of an eye. And we have to get used to that, because what is now unimaginable, the United States could really collapse, the United States could stop being a democracy, it will at one time seem like inevitable. And I would just say it this way. The question that we hear asked in the media is, how could the US fall apart? How could it become a non-democratic regime or an authoritarian regime? And I would ask another question. How could it not? Don't ask how this could fall apart, and don't allow that discourse. The question is, how could this survive? And I don't think there are any answers to that, any easy answers. I will say this. What we saw in the period really beginning before the election, but focusing just on the time the polls closed until the time Joe Biden swore in, was a very ugly chapter in American history. A very ugly few weeks. I'm sure we all remember that. That was when the big lie about the election got traction. That was the insurrection of January 6th. We've all seen the videos and discussed that. And that was, importantly, when the Republican Party began to pivot from this is a terrible thing to, well, it wasn't, it's not such a big deal. The period after the next election will be worse. And the reason for that is that it is, I think, extremely likely that either Donald Trump, if his health holds up, will be the nominee, if not someone quite like him. If he is the nominee, and here I'm talking about 2024, we will likely have a situation that Republicans control one or both houses of Congress, like they did this time. There will be a Democratic president, and that Democratic president, Joe Biden, will have to decide, who presumably very likely will win that election. Donald Trump is a terrible politician, a terrible vote getter. He will have to decide that he is going to use force against those demonstrators, who will come back in larger numbers more violently than January 6th. And that is a real breaking point for the American political system. Or he will decide not to use violence and they will run through the Capitol and commit their own acts of violence. That's where this is heading. And there's no way to get around that. And there's no way that another discussion of what Senate seat is in play, or what it will take to get Joe Manchin on board, or will Mitch McConnell extend the debt ceiling, or all the nonsense that passes for political reporting and political discourse now, no amount of that is going to change that. So on that cheery note, I want to move on and raise a different set of questions that take a lot of my time. And that is this question of post-democratic America. What does post-democratic America look like? And the answer to that is I don't know. I don't know what post-democratic America looks like. But I want to lay out some scenarios. But before I do that, I want to stress something. Yesterday, I was in Philadelphia, or as Trump's impeachment lawyer referred to it, Philadelphia. And of all things, I was going to a baseball game, which is a whole other part of my research and writing, but I was going to a baseball game. The Phillies were playing the Pirates, and nobody was wearing a mask. I mean, I would say of the 30,000 people there, I saw maybe 100 masks. I mean, it was very, very rare. Even the people selling concessions weren't wearing a mask. There was no vaccine mandate. We ended up switching seats and sitting kind of more away from people. There were no vaccine mandates. There's no vaccine that you have to show proof when you go to the ballpark in Philadelphia. And it felt, and the Phillies won, and it was a good game, and they're in the pennant race. And it felt like a very normal American event. And around the 7th or 8th inning, I really started thinking to myself, this does not seem like a group of 30,000 people. Now, remember, this is baseball. So the demographic is the grandpa demographic, as a social critic Greg Proops has called it. It's people who are, white, male, I mean, generally speaking, whiter, more male, and older than the American population generally. So this is and if you look at how those people vote, this is probably a more conservative than the older population generally. This does not look like a people who are living in a country that is on a cusp of collapse. And I think a lot of us wrestle with that our analytical tools tell us one thing, and then our observations tell us something different. And these two things are not in conflict, because it's important to note there are many, many countries in the world that are not democratic, where a good chunk of the people either tell themselves that it is a democracy, or rationalize away the absence of democracy. Think of America for much of its history and go on about their lives. And it works for them, but it really doesn't work for everybody. And that gives me a sense, one, that I think my analysis is right, and two, where this is heading. So what does post-democratic America look like? I'm going to give 3 or 4 scenarios here. And I don't know, I can't assign percentages to them, but I would say the first 3 are roughly 30% each. The last one is about 10%. The first one is simple. They win. What does that mean? It means we move towards a country where there are 2 classes of citizenship, maybe more, but there's one class of citizenship that is if you are white, male, straight, and Christian. And that is full citizenship. That is the tier 1, if you will, of citizenship. Tier 2 is everybody else. And where and now within tier 2, it could be tier 2 A, B, C. I don't want to get into that right now, but that is where this is going. That is the agenda of the forces of authoritarianism. And we see that with regards to, for example, voter suppression laws that are being passed. We certainly see that with regards to, for example, the new abortion law in Texas. And don't think for a moment that Texas is the only state that will do this. We see we'll move towards those kinds of abortion laws. We see that in other Supreme Court decisions that are undermining, for example, the ruling on the abortion case. We see this over and over again, right? And that is, I think, a very likely place this is going, and that is frankly a terrifying place. That is the consolidated non-democratic regime in America, and you can call that what you want. You can call it authoritarian, you can call it fascism, and if this were a political science seminar, which mercifully it's not, we would have a discussion about where it fits there. But that's the non-democratic consolidated regime. The second is also, I think, relatively likely, and this I call collapse. And people, particularly on the right, who think of themselves as kind of weekend warrior, macho types, like to talk about civil war. And civil war is a terrifying idea. Certainly, in the United States, we had a very bloody civil war, as we know. But in the 21st century, civil war is not people with one uniform on one side and one uniform on the other. It is the collapse of the state. And that is what we are seeing. That is the effect of a lot of the politics today. For example, the anti-vaccine movement, which weakens state institutions, which weakens our medical structures, which thrives and is based on undermining confidence in what's left of our functioning state institutions, right? The fights between people storming school boards, threatening, assaulting members of school boards. This is government, it's very local level here, because they want, to have students wear masks, or they want teachers to wear masks, right? So we are seeing that. We are seeing that an extreme example, the president trying to intervene in an election in a state to undermine the rule of law in that state because it serves its purposes. So we're seeing more and more of these examples, and that is collapse. And that where the ball bounces after that, I don't know, but that can't be ruled out. The third case is the stumble along, and the stumble along is not good, because what we've had the last few years isn't good. But you could certainly see we're not at the breaking point. We're not necessarily, or it's not a given that we're at the breaking point yet. And the reason for that is that American civil society is very strong. American institutions are very strong. So, you could see a situation where the Republicans win back the House. If the Republicans win back the House, they take off, in January 2023, by April, Joe Biden will be impeached. I think that's a given. Now, some of you may be asking, what would they impeach Joe Biden for? The answer to that is it doesn't matter. It's not the point. He would be impeached because they're Republicans. The Senate would never vote for removal, but his legislative agenda would be completely stalled. Kevin McCarthy would have a platform to spread law. You can see where that goes. There's an election. It's ugly at the end. Donald Trump loses, but there's some violence, but Joe Biden's able to maintain the presidency, but there's further erosion. The security forces are no longer unified. That's the kind of stumbling along, and that could last a while. But that also erodes the state and erodes the democracy. And the last, just because I don't want to be so gloomy, is that a new and stronger democracy emerges. And that's possible. But I can't explain I can't stress the extent to which that is unlikely. There's really no reason to think that's going to happen, except for that we want it to happen. But I don't know what the strategy is to make that happen, because so much of it relies on rethinking the Constitution. Right now, the Constitution handcuffs our democracy. And it's not a matter of getting rid of the filibuster, which, by the way, is not in the Constitution. And I'm all for abolishing the filibuster. But to me, the question about abolishing the filibuster is, why is Joe Manchin in the Senate in the first place? Why does South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, who combined have fewer people than Brooklyn, have 8 senators? Right? That is, why does the electoral vote exist? And the answer is the Constitution, which stifles the discourse on democracy. The other example I would give from the Constitution is the Second Amendment. We all know what the Second Amendment is. It is a right that some people value very intensely, but one has to ask, if civilians are this heavily armed and using fear that way, that begins to undermine democracy. And we've all seen this. We've all seen video or been to demonstrations where the counter demonstrators are there with I don't know the names of the weapons, but with big looking guns. And that is a form of intimidation. But of course, as we all know intuitively, the Second Amendment in America here only applies to white people, right? So it's a right given to one group of citizens and others don't enjoy it. And that right is used to intimidate. So a right of violence is given to one group of people. So I don't know how we get from here to there, but we can't rule it out. And the challenge, if there's one challenge, is to figure out how that happens, to figure out what tools we can use, and importantly, to impress upon our leaders that that the crisis is real, which is something that they still wrestle with. It is still a minority of, for example, elected officials, even on the Democratic side of the aisle, who recognize quite how serious the crisis is. So I want to just take a few minutes and flesh out a couple of other points about, in addition to the undemocratic structure of the Constitution, of what I think, why I think this crisis is so intense. When we went to the streets and celebrated in November of last year, there was this sense, and we heard it in the media, democracy survived, democracy is restored. And because the media insists on seeing everything through a drunk on, apple pie and baseball, patriotic, jingoistic lens, this proves the American system is strong. We heard that as well. But quite the opposite. A democracy that depends on one party winning is not a democracy, right? A democracy, a country where where democracy is on the ballot every time, is not a democracy. And that is the country we are in now. And furthermore, I want to just touch, I haven't spent a lot of time on voter suppression because I think we all know about that. And I may come back to it if we have a little time, but I want to just stress one thing about voter suppression. Voter suppression in a handful of states, we all know the states, but let's say Texas, Georgia, Florida, a few others, delegitimizes the entire government. A Senate that includes people who win narrowly is not a legitimate legislative body. A president who carries states where votes have been suppressed in his favor is not a legitimate president. And that is not going to go away. If Ted Cruz, well, he's not up yet, but if Ted Cruz next time he's up, which would be in 2024, narrowly wins in Texas in an election where there is voter suppression, he will not be a legitimate member of the United States Senate. If he's part of a narrow majority, that majority will not be legitimate. And people will know that. One of the biggest changes I've seen in the last 20, 30 years in American politics is how widespread, and this is a great thing, the awareness that these institutions are broken, that these institutions are not democratic. And I think it goes without saying that any decision by the Supreme Court of the United States with such wonderful exemplars of judicial temperament as Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, that any court that includes those people, any decision they make of the kind of, Bush v. Gore in 2000 will not be seen as legitimate and will lead to appropriately massive demonstrations. But I just want to mention a couple of other things because I have one more point here on this. One of, I believe, the more bizarre developments in the Trump years was the desperation in the media to hold on to this idea of the never Trumpers, that the Republican Party, there were some people with principles. And I recall going on a television show a few days after the January 6th insurrection with, some clown from the South somewhere who was, an advisor to Donald Trump, which, means, I don't know quite what that means because I don't know what it's like to give Donald Trump advice, but he was, he had a relationship with the president at that time with Donald Trump. And he said, look, the party understands this. They're done with Donald Trump. And I said to him nicely as I could, listen, if the Republican Party primary were tomorrow, Donald Trump would win in a landslide. And again, I'm not saying that because I'm particularly prescient, but just because it's obvious. It was obvious. And of course, now what's happened is we've seen that the price of the ticket to be part of the Republican Party is the fealty to Donald Trump. You cannot be a member of the Republican Party, and I know about Anna Kinzinger and I know about Liz Cheney, but these are the exceptions that prove the rule, unless you start from the point that election wasn't real and Joe Biden isn't a legitimate president. Now, some of these Republicans are kind of dancing both ways. They're saying one thing, but they're acting, the other way, but it doesn't matter. The Republican Party is committed to the lie that Donald Trump won the election, which is the Republican Party continues to live in fear of Donald Trump. But of course, that lets them off too easy. What are they really afraid of? Do you know what happens if you lose your job in the United States Senate? Do you know what happens if you lose an election? Unless it's some terrible scandal. I don't know if any of you have been senators who've lost your bids for re-election, but I'll tell you what happens. You spend a lifetime sitting on corporate boards, attending a few meetings a year, making hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year for that privilege. If you're from a small state, you get to go back and maybe get a center set up at a university where you teach one seminar a semester every now and then. You remain involved in politics. You get very lucrative speaking engagements. There's no downside in the terms of a normal human being of losing an election. So they're not doing it out of fear. They're doing it because Trump is the Republican Party and the Republican Party is Trump. They're doing it because they believe it and they believe in him. And they're doing it because they're committed to that vision that I talked about earlier of the 2 tiers of citizenship. So to let people off by saying they're just afraid of Trump is not okay, because that's not an excuse. There's no downside to standing up to Trump. And well, here there's a downside. Liz Cheney might lose her primary. Okay, I mean, Liz Cheney's no gem either, but if she loses her primary, so what? That doesn't affect Liz Cheney. It only affects her in terms of her career in the House of Representatives. But that's the kind of people talking about making sacrifices for their country. Losing a primary is not a big sacrifice. But this is the Republican Party. From the people running from the Ron DeSantis's and the Ted Cruz down to the county chairs and the deputy county chairs. This is who they are. And they're not the majority party. And the last time they carried the majority of the vote in a presidential election was 2004, or plurality. The time before that was 1988, right? They almost always lose a majority of the votes cast for the House of Representatives and for the Senate. But they are a sizable minority that has more political power than they should because of the political, because of the quirks, the undemocratic quirks of our Constitution. And I just want to wrap up with a word or two on COVID, because I don't think I cannot address this. 2020, we're now kind of the fall of 2021, but if we turn back the clock 14 or 15 months, I've not experienced a summer like that in the United States, between the kind of massive demonstrations and uprisings after the killing of George Floyd, the fear of COVID, which was very terrible in many states at the time. In my case, the knowledge that the election was going to be, they were going to try to steal the election, and what were people doing about that? There was a sense of things could get, really terrible. And they did for a while. They could have gotten worse. They could always get worse. And now here we are 15 months later. It's now fall of 2021. And according to the New York Times, 2,000 people are dying a day of COVID. 2,000 people. That is, I think, more than many days that summer. And this is, now we all know, I don't know if any of you have had COVID. I assume if we're all in New York, we've all, I would assume, had people close to us, lost people with COVID. It's pretty bad here in New York City. But we all know that COVID is a disease. We all know, different levels of expertise about virology, but we know it's a virus, how you can try to stop yourself from getting it and try to keep others safe. We all know about the vaccine, which can really help you keep you safe. But what is going on now is not a pandemic caused by a disease. It is a deliberate effort by the Republican Party to kill Americans in the hopes that it will accelerate the destabilization and accelerate Biden's failure as a president. That is literally what is going on. And I only say this once, I think it has to be said, but also because that tells us the extent to which one side is willing to play hardball and the effect of that hardball. And that is why it is both essential that we stop it, but very, very difficult. We are dealing with a force that is so committed to destroying American democracy that they will accelerate the deaths of Americans, often their own voters. They have weaponized this disease for a political purpose. The anti-mask movement, the anti-vax movement, these are leading to deaths of Americans, often Americans who are wearing masks and who are taking the precautions, but they are also increasing the destabilization of the United States, undermining our already tenuous political institutions. So I was almost as optimistic as I promised, but that's my sense of where we stand here in the fall of 2021. And I apologize that I don't have any easy answers. I do promise that if I do have some, I'll tell you right away.
Thank you, Lincoln, for your talk. that is where we are today. There have been some signs that people hold on to about things getting better, and there's a lot about things getting more dangerous. What we do know, and you have just really reemphasized it, is that we can't just sit back and rest and hope that everything will clear up on its own. At this point, we're going to say goodbye to those watching just on video and invite you to participate live some future Sunday. A calendar of our events is at rysec.org.